Thank you, Daryl, so much. And thank you for listening to me. I'm grateful to be invited to this important conference. So thanks to the other leaders besides Pastor Daryl for inviting me. They know the truth of the biblical proverb, the one who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him, in Proverbs 18. Now, you may still not be persuaded of what I have to say by the time I'm done, but I thought I'd give it a try. I'm going to present a position that is different from that of others here. I trust that we'll all try to listen to each other with an open mind. These are difficult issues. Just as there are many Israeli Jews who have suffered deep and tragic personal losses, there are many Palestinians who have suffered deep and tragic personal losses. Neither side has a monopoly on pain or reasons for bitterness. My argument will be almost entirely theological. I believe it's something both Christian Arabs and believing Jews can agree on, no matter what their political positions. And let me state my case up front. There's no reason why Christians cannot support justice and statehood for Palestinians, while also seeing that the Jewish return to the land in the last 150 years is a partial fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Not either or, but both and. And as Dr. Munther Isaac put it yesterday, Christians should support a sharing of the land that is thoroughly biblical. I used to be a supersessionist. In fact, for most of my adult life, I believed that after Jesus, God transferred the covenant from Jewish Israel to the new Israel of the church, because most of Jewish Israel rejected Jesus as Messiah. I read the parable of the tenants in Matthew 21 that way. The vineyard owner let out his vineyard to new tenants, Gentiles in the church, after the wicked tenants beat, killed, and stoned his servants, and finally his own son. I believed that the New Testament changed everything about the covenant. God had originally made it with Abraham and his Jewish progeny, focused on this particular people and its particular land, that tiny strip on the eastern Mediterranean the size of New Jersey. But that Jesus came to universalize the particular. He extended the kingdom from being about one people to all peoples, and from one little land to the whole world. While the Old Testament put the kingdom in physical terms, the New Testament transformed the physical into the spiritual. As a result, true Israel is no more Jewish Israel, but simply the church, which has accepted Jesus, Gentiles and Jews alike. Because of Jesus, there are no more distinctions between Jews and Gentiles. The Jewish people, apart from Jesus, are of no particular interest to God anymore. And the land of Israel is of no more importance to God than the land of Thailand. But then I had a wake-up call that started me questioning all these presumptions. I started seeing things in the New Testament that conflicted with this elegant picture. For example, Romans 11, 28 and 29. A passage that had been largely ignored by the church until after the Holocaust. Scholars and theologians asked, what did we miss that allowed this to happen in what was perhaps the most Christianized country in history, Germany? Both Protestant and Catholic scholars agreed that they had missed the plain statement by Paul that God still loves the Jewish people, even those who rejected Jesus, and that his covenant with Jewish Israel is still in place. They are, as Paul put it, the enemies of the gospel, but are beloved for the sake of their forefathers. For the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable, cannot be revoked. That is, their calling to be God's chosen people is still in place, even at this point late in Paul's career, in Paul's most mature reflections on Jews and Gentiles. Now, does Paul mean here merely that Jews have an historic honor? That would suggest that God's covenant was in place, but is no longer. But Paul most clearly uses the present tense, are beloved. Besides, just a few chapters before, he suggested the same thing, that his kinsmen according to the flesh, to them, he said, belong, again, present tense, the adoption, the glory, the covenants, and the promises, Romans 9, 3 and 4. But you say they were Paul's enemy, and they were God's enemy, according to Paul's own words. You're right. But Paul makes clear they were God's and his beloved enemy. But they've been unfaithful to God. They had failed the terms of the covenant again and again, and most recently by rejecting the Messiah. Yes, true. But notice that Paul believed the same thing, and yet he insists that does not mean they're no longer in the covenant. What if some, he says in Romans 3, what if some were unfaithful? Does their faithfulness nullify the faithfulness of God? By no means. Let God be true, even if everyone is a liar. Now, later in this letter, back in chapter 11 of Romans, he says that God purposely hardened the Jews who rejected Jesus, purposely closed their eyes. And yet, when there's a remnant that does accept Jesus, that remnant is a small piece from the whole lump of dough and is the first fruits. But the whole lump from which it's taken, Paul says, is holy. And if the root of the olive tree, Israel, is holy, so are the branches. Now, that's Romans 11, 15, and 16. But you might say, Jerry, you don't understand. Look, today's Israel is almost entirely secular and is the farthest cry from biblical Israel, which at least was religious, even if the wrong version of religious. My Jewish Israeli friends tell me that there is a spiritual renewal going on in Israel today from the top to the bottom of society, but that it's under the radar. It will never be on CNN. That Israelis are seeking the God of Israel unbeknownst to most of the rest of the world. And I have some Israeli friends who are very, very, very pro-Palestinian, hate Netanyahu, and are seeking the God of Israel. But you might say, even if that were true, it doesn't matter. Because Paul says in Galatians 3:28 that because of Christ, there's neither Gentile nor Jew anymore. All are one in Christ Jesus. And there are to be no more distinctions, certainly not ethnic distinctions. But I started to realize that there's a problem with this argument. For Paul also says in this verse that in Christ there is neither male nor female. And he made clear distinctions between male and female roles in church and home. Now, we can disagree with one another as evangelicals on how to interpret those Pauline household codes and church leadership passages, but the mere fact that we disagree shows that there are, in the plain sense of the text, male-female differences that have to be dealt with. So if after Jesus there are no more distinctions between Jews and Gentiles, why does Paul seem to persist in discussing male-female differences after Jesus? After getting stuck on these sorts of problems, I took another look at the Matthew 21 parable of the wicked tenants that seemed just to justify the idea that God transferred the covenant from Jewish Israel to the mostly Gentile church. On a closer look, it became apparent that the servants the vineyard owner sent were Jewish prophets, and the new tenants were probably the Jewish apostles whom Jesus had elsewhere indicated would head up the reconstitution of the 12 tribes of Israel. This same Matthew says in chapter 19 that the apostles will one day rule the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, E.P. Sanders, a great New Testament scholar, wrote that these passages imply that the early church believed in a future restoration of Israel. So there's no transfer from Jews to Gentiles here, but a transfer from wicked Jews to faithful Jews. But these passages are just the tip of the iceberg. Jesus had other things to say about future distinctions between Jews and Gentiles. For example, he said one day in the future, the Jews of Jerusalem will welcome him. That's Luke 13:35. But it's not just Jesus in the New Testament. Paul also believes that Jews in Israel will have a distinct future, even while the gospel goes out to the Gentile nations. He says in Romans 11 that after the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, then all Israel will be saved. Now, what does he mean by all Israel there? Is this a mixed church of Jews and Gentiles? It doesn't appear to be. In the same chapter, he identifies this same Israel as Zion and Jacob. Earlier in the chapter, he refers to verse 14, my fellow Jews, as the Israel that failed to obtain what he was seeking. Verse 7, there's no sign that he suddenly switches from Jewish Israel to some other sort of Israel. So I started to realize that while the coming of the Messiah has changed everything related to salvation, it has not changed the distinction between men and women. Neither has it changed the distinction between Israel and the rest of the world, or between Jews and Gentiles. Now it's noteworthy that we continue to see these distinctions in Romans, his most mature theology. Even here, where I had previously thought all Jewish distinctions and advantages for Jews have been abolished, surprisingly, they were still there. Think of Romans 3. Circumcision, Paul says, is of value if you obey the law. And Paul suggested it was possible to obey the law at one level. He says in Philippians, he was blameless as to righteousness under the law. And Paul goes on to say in Romans 3, being a Jew is an advantage. Now, this is Paul right before the end of his life. Much in every way. But I had a hard time accepting this. Isn't this Jewish exceptionalism? Is God giving here special privileges to Jews? I would say yes and no. Yes, insofar as they were given the burden of chosenness, and look at their history, it's been a huge burden, and he didn't give that burden of chosenness, special chosenness, to the Egyptians or the Canaanites. No, the Jews had a special covenant, a special worship, which gave privileges but also discipline and painful exile when they broke the terms of the covenant. But no to my question, insofar as Jews and Gentiles alike must come to the Father through the Son, the Jewish Messiah. There are no dual covenants. Being Jewish does not make them automatically saved. As Paul said, many are in Israel, but not of Israel. But what I have just said, while difficult to receive, is easier than the other part of God's covenant with Jewish Israel, and that's the land. Now, some say that Jesus never referred to it, and that Paul never mentioned it. That while the land was obviously significant for the Old Testament, it's entirely insignificant for the New Testament. And there in the New Testament, the soul focuses on the whole world, and not this little strip of land on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean. And for many years, I agreed with this. It made perfect sense to me. But once I started seeing a future for the Jewish people as Jews in God's purposes, I also started to see that a future for the land of Israel was also on the radar of the New Testament authors. But why did I? And why did so many others miss this, and particularly before the Holocaust? I submit that we have missed the ongoing significance of the land in the New Testament because we've been trained to miss it. We have accepted the myth that the Old Testament is concerned after its first 11 chapters solely with a particular people in a particular land, but that the New Testament reverses that narrow and provincial focus with a new concern for the universal, the whole world. And Paul seems to have confirmed this when he wrote in Romans 4:13 of the promise to Abraham that he would inherit the world. And now another reason that we Christians have missed the land in the New Testament, I think, is that we have missed the overwhelming focus on land in the Old Testament. Most of us know that a dominant theme in the Old Testament, perhaps the predominant theme for at least those of us who are Reformed, is covenant. But few recognize that 70% of the time when covenant is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, it's linked explicitly to the promise of the land. It's also because of the sheer profusion of references in the Old Testament to the promised land. It appears more than 1,000 times. Now, according to the Dictionary of Biblical Imagery, I hesitate on the word because I'm a stutterer. So according to the Dictionary of Biblical Imagery, longing for land is stronger in the Old Testament than for anything else except God. This is so particularly in the Pentateuch. Gerhard von Rad, the great Old Testament scholar, wrote a half century ago, of all the promises made to the patriarchs, it was that of the land that was the most prominent and decisive. Now, a further reason I think that we've lost the theological meaning of the land is that we tend to assume that it's not significant anymore. And this assumption has caused us to miss the places in the New Testament where it suggests that it still is. For example, when Jesus implicitly promised that he would restore the kingdom to Israel in Acts 1:6, he also told the disciples that the Father appointed times and seasons by his own authority for things such as this, Acts 1:7. Scholars have observed that the Greek words for times and restore are the same word or root, kairos and kathistemi, that are used in Acts 3:21, where Peter speaks of future restoration, and Luke 21, where Jesus speaks of the times of the Gentiles between the destruction of Jerusalem and its restoration. This adds weight to the interpretation that in Acts 1:6, Jesus is speaking indeed of a future restoration of Israel in Jerusalem. Now, the Oxford historian Marcus Bockmuehl has written of this remarkable statement by Jesus in Acts 1:6, that this shows that the early church was expecting a future restoration of Israel. Now I've already mentioned the place where Jesus spoke of the day when the inhabitants of Jerusalem will welcome him, and that Paul wrote in Romans 11:29 that the gifts of God to Israel were irrevocable, cannot be revoked. Now, for Hellenistic Jews, such as Philo and Josephus and Ezekiel the tragedian, the primary gift of God to Israel was the land. It's the primary referent for gift in all the Old Testament, and arguably for Paul too. Now Robert Wilken, the great historian of the early church, writes in his book, The Land Called Holy, that early Christians interpreted these and other passages, such as the angel telling Mary that God would give Jesus the throne of David and that Jesus would rule over the house of Jacob forever, as indications of future restoration and the establishment of a kingdom in Jerusalem. Besides, Paul did write of the land in his sermon at the synagogue in Pisidian Antioch. Recounting the Exodus, he then said, quote, "After destroying 7 nations in the land of Canaan, God gave them their land as an inheritance." That's Acts 13:19. That's covenantal language, frequently found in Deuteronomy, where the land is a principal gift of God's covenant with Abraham. Now, were these early Christians naive to think that Jesus had any concern for Israel as a distinct land anymore? Didn't Jesus make it clear in his Beatitudes that his focus was on the whole earth and not this little tiny land of Israel? Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Matthew 5:5. Probably not. More and more scholars are recognizing that a better translation of this verse is, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the land." Matthew is translating into Greek Psalm 37:11, where the Hebrew eretz refers to the land of Israel. In fact, 4 other verses in Psalm 37 repeat the phrase, "inherit the land," with the clear meaning of the land of Israel. The implication was that Jesus' disciples would be able to enjoy the land of Israel, if not live there, in the palingenesia, or renewal of all things, that Jesus predicted in Matthew 19. Now, as I alluded, Peter also seemed to look forward to a special future for the land of Israel. In his second speech in Jerusalem after the Pentecost miracle, Acts 3:21, he spoke of a future apokatastasis, or restoration that was to come. Now, this was the Greek word used in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which the early church principally used, and which Peter was obviously familiar with, for the future return of Jews from all over the world to the land of Israel to reestablish a Jewish nation. Now, apparently, Peter did not think that the return of the Babylonian exiles at the end of the 6th century BC fulfilled all the prophecies of a future worldwide return to the land. Now, the author of the book of Revelation was another witness to a future for the land. He wrote that the 2 witnesses will be killed in Jerusalem, and the battle of Armageddon will be in that Megiddo Valley in northern Israel. The renewed earth comes down not as the new Rome or the new Alexandria, but as the new Jerusalem. Its 12 gates are inscribed with the names of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel. That's Revelation 21, whose mention reminds leaders of their life and work in the land. But what about Paul in Romans 4:13? Abraham inherits the world, not just a little land. Doesn't this mean that Christ has overturned any biblical right for Jews to possess even part of the land? I don't think so. First, the context is Old Testament promises of descendants, people, rather than land. Paul goes on in the passage to talk about Abraham being the father of many nations. Second, as Tom Schreiner has pointed out, it was commonplace in Second Temple Judaism to talk about Israel inheriting both the land of Israel and the whole world. The idea was that Abraham's seed would rule the world, but also would inherit the land of Israel. Not either or, but both and. This is strongly implied in the Pentateuch, both particularity in the land and universality in blessing to the world. So nothing new in Romans 4:13. Now some might concede everything I've said so far, but point to John's Gospel, perhaps the latest piece of New Testament literature, for evidence that the last major New Testament theologian relativized all these local references to Israel. After all, they would argue, Jesus told the Judeans that his body would be the new temple, and informed the Samaritan woman that true worship was no longer restricted to Jerusalem, but would now be anywhere as long as it was in spirit and in truth. The formidable New Testament scholar Richard Hayes is not so sure, and Hayes, by the way, is a Methodist. He's not so sure that this new worship completely eclipses worship in Jerusalem. In his recent book, Reading Backwards, a great book, I would recommend it, he notes that in Mark's account, Jesus quotes Isaiah's prediction that the temple will become a house of prayer for all the nations. This means for Hayes that Jesus agrees with Isaiah's prediction that Jerusalem will be restored in the future in a way where foreigners will come to God's holy mountain to join the outcasts of Israel whom God has gathered there. Hayes does not think that Jesus' claim about his body as the new temple is supersessionist, as if the church has replaced Israel, or that this claim is hostile to continuity with Israel. I would add that Matthew tells us that Jesus still believed that God dwells in the temple, Matthew 23:21. And so, in other words, we can think of the temple in two ways, not just one, both as God's house, the physical temple, and as a symbol of the way that Jesus' body would be God's house. I would argue that in much of the Bible, there are multiple layers in every text, and we make a mistake when we reduce every text to a single layer and a single meaning. True worship in the future will be in every place where there is worship in spirit and truth, and in the end of days, it will be centered in Jerusalem. The two witnesses will lie dead there, Revelation 11. The 144,000, who, by the way, are all Jews, will stand there on Mount Zion. That's Revelation 7:4 and 14:1. Gog and Magog will surround the saints there in Jerusalem, or at least in Israel. And the new earth will be centered there. So there are significant lines of evidence, I would say, after all, that the land of Israel is theologically significant for the authors of the New Testament, not just because of its past history, but also because of its ongoing role in the history of redemption. This, of course, begs the question in 1948. Was the establishment of the State of Israel a part of that prophesied history? Is this part of what Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and other prophets meant by their predictions that Jews would return to the land from all over the world? Does this mean that the massive ingathering of Jews to the land in the 19th century and then their organization of a protective state are somehow part of the fulfillment of not only Old Testament prophecies, but also apostolic expectations of a time of renewal and restoration? Now, many Christians don't want to go that far. They're willing to say that God is committed to the people of Israel, but they're wary of connecting their modern return to biblical expectations. They fear this might suggest lack of sympathy for Palestinian suffering or Palestinian claims for their own state in the same land. Some are willing to say that 1948 might represent God's providential concern for his covenanted people, but that the establishment of the state of Israel falls far short of the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. My response is severalfold. First, there's no reason why Christians cannot support legitimate Palestinian aspirations for justice and statehood, and at the same time see the establishment of a protective state that protects the covenanted people after they return to the land as a partial fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Now, the Israeli government has offered a two-state solution several times to Palestinian leadership. Now, it doesn't matter what we think of the justice or sincerity of these offers. What matters is that the Jewish state itself has committed itself publicly to Palestinian statehood, so that even the Zionist state does not see its claims for itself to preclude Palestinian self-rule. And neither should Christians think that a prophetic understanding of 1948 precludes Palestinian rights to land and statehood. And so, in other words, we non-Palestinian Christians can and should care for our Palestinian brothers and sisters without denying prophetic fulfillment, at least in part, to the recent return of Jews to the land. Now, some Christians say that Israel cannot be, that the state of Israel today cannot be a prophetic fulfillment because of all the continuing problems and injustices in Israel today. There are injustices, large and small, experienced by Palestinians. There are racial tensions. There are attacks on Messianic Jews by the ultra-Orthodox. There's government corruption. There's what seems to be secularism in many sectors of the populace. These problems seem to make it impossible for these Christians to say that today's Israel is related to biblical Israel. I think we need to recall that what we Christians say about ourselves and the church. We are the body of Christ, we say. Despite our deep divisions, our moral sin, and our theological heresies, with all of our egregious spots and wrinkles, we still say that we are the people of God, prophesied throughout the Old Testament. And so, in other words, we exercise prophetic and eschatological charity about ourselves. Why do we find it so difficult to do the same for another people, whom the Bible also calls specially chosen, and I would argue in both Testaments? Now, would this be bad for Palestinians? Would this encourage the wrong kind of exceptionalism that would prevent Palestinians from ever having their own state on the West Bank? As I've said, there's no theological reason for thinking so. In fact, the Bible's theological exceptionalism for Jewish Israel requires that Jews, quote, do righteousness and justice, as Gary Burge has eloquently written, and I've learned from his books over the years. Nothing in the promises to Israel precludes their sharing the land with Palestinians, as Dr. Isaac said yesterday. Furthermore, there's biblical precedent for this with Lot. Abraham shared the land with Lot. But going beyond sharing the land is living together in peace and respect for one another. Can Palestinians and Jews live together in a way that ensures peace and prosperity for Palestinians? I think the beginning to answer that question requires asking hard questions, such as, where else in the Middle East, except in Israel proper, can Palestinians openly criticize the government and sleep securely in their beds that night? Where else can Arab Christians freely practice their faith? Now, Those of us in the New Christian Zionism, and our project is not a dispensationalist project, do not take an uncritical approach to the Israeli government. But we also know that Palestinian Christians have more to deal with than just Israelis, than just the Israeli government. They live under a PA president who's in the 14th year of a 4-year term, whose regime leaves Palestinian citizens in a climate of fear. They can neither vote nor criticize the PA. Just last summer, there was instituted a new cybercrime law that threatens with arrest anyone whose posts on social media are interpreted as criticizing the government. The PA has imprisoned journalists for exposing the corruption of the PA. So the PA is without accountability. In 2016, a Palestinian poll found that 64% of Palestinians want President Abbas to resign. They know that while he and his sons and cronies are profiting enormously from the status quo, most ordinary Palestinians are not. According to Palestinian scholar Khalil Shikaki, 42% of Palestinians still want a negotiated settlement toward a two-state solution. But Abbas has repeatedly refused negotiations. Arab Christians are also threatened by Muslims in the land. When I walked the land of Galilee in 2009, staying at night with both Jews and Palestinians, time and again I was told by Arab Christians in whispers, and they always said, "Don't use my name," for fear of being overheard. We have our problems with the government of Israel, but our biggest enemy is not the Israeli government, but our Muslim cousins and their frightening theology. Samir Kumsieh, now I may be pronouncing his name wrong, a Christian in Beit Sahor near Bethlehem, fights for the rights of Arab Christians. He has dared to speak out against the subjugation of Christians who live under Hamas in Gaza. He regularly gets death threats. He once was the target of a petrol bomb attack. He says, quote, "Each day we hear and see some radical Muslim clerics speaking strongly against Christians. One said recently, Christian Copts in the Coptic church in Egypt should be slaughtered like sheep." I hope this conference will be a prophetic voice discussing how to protect Arab Christians threatened by both the PA and Muslims in the land. If the only enemy at this conference turns out to be the Israeli government, then it would seem that the full truth is not being told, and the real concerns of Palestinian Christians are not being fully addressed. But I hope to see that this is not the case. Thank you.